All right, joining us now, a Catholic wonderkind, actually, in the whole cultural events world, Jack Posobiec, formerly of One American News Network, and just very recently, now working at Human Events as, what's your position there, Jack, now?
Now the senior editor for Human Events. Very excited, and still nothing but love for the my whole family back at One American News. But I'm really excited for this new endeavor to kind of go into the Human Events brand and bring it back from kind of the the world of the internet, and we're now bringing it back to kind of regain that new position where it once held, really going all the way back to the 1940s. And if you look back in the earlier days of the conservative movement, Human Events, it's actually known as Ronald Reagan. It was his favorite magazine back when he was in the White House. So we're trying to regain some of those days and bring the brand back.
Absolutely. Well, they made a wise choice in selecting you. So we wish you and Human Events all the best in that new endeavor with each other. Just for our audience,
we'll see. I'm still not sure exactly what they were thinking, but hopefully they think it's a good idea.
Well, humility is good for you. That's good. But, you're a talented guy, bright guy. So for our audience, let's establish just a couple of things first. You are baptized Catholic. You believe the faith. You go to Mass, all of those things, right?
We're there every week. We're there receiving communion. My sons aren't old enough for communion yet, but they're well on their way. Marty, we say the rosary every morning with my boys, and we go to bed holding hands and saying the Our Father. We say the Hail Mary, and then we do. And I'm starting to teach them Latin just a little bit, and I've got my 3-year-old he can at least do the sign of the cross in Latin. It's actually at the point where he knows before every meal he will not take a bite until everybody holds hands and we say grace. It's really wonderful to be able to see that. As my son, and then we have a 6-month-old who's coming along. But this is my mission, right? This with raising them and their faith formation. That is my public work. Sure, the reporting, the writing, yes, absolutely. But this divine mission, this is so important.
Absolutely. So good. Just always nice to check all those boxes for our audience so they know who they're talking to. Your son probably knows a little bit more Latin than the vast majority of Catholics, actually, even at his young, tender age. So good for you, being a good dad. Let's talk about, you're publishing this new book on Antifa and all the goings-on and sort of the, what's behind the scenes of Antifa. But we were speaking off-air, something that our audience, I think, be most interested in is sort of the psychology, almost spirituality of how Antifa has managed to sort of capture the imagination of so many folks these days. Let's get into that a little bit. You're saying this is sort of filling a void of young people. They see nothing in the world, largely the fault of organized religion and even specifically Catholicism. They see nothing that's appealing there they want to go fight for, so they turn their attentions to these.
Right, and you definitely see that. In the book, we go through the past iterations of Antifa. We go through the anarchist movement, various communist movements, Russia. We talk about the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the origin of the CCP. We get into the anarchists who actually shot and killed President McKinley in the United States. This is what allowed Teddy Roosevelt to become president our youngest president, actually, at the age of 44. And then we get into the Antifa of today. And typically when you see these types of groups, they are, from the start, they are completely atheistic. They are prey on nihilism, right? And what they do is they present the ability for one of these nihilistic young youths to be able to go out, and they're tapping into that energy, that anger, that angst in sort of the teenage to early to mid 20s age range that everybody goes through, right? It's part of our natural formation. It's part of our spiritual formation, our biological formation, just as people. But what these groups do is they're tapping into that and walking them up directly and using that. And we refer to the great, the longshoreman philosopher Eric Hoffer, who once wrote that not every movement needs a God, but every movement needs a devil. And they present them that devil in the form of what they call social fascism. And so social fascism, I think, if you even go back to the doctrinaire writings of of Trotsky, who is actually saying that social fascism, and then Stalin actually, this is one of the things that Stalin agreed with Trotsky on, one of the few things. We all know how that turned out with the ice pick in Mexico. But when it comes to social fascism, was the idea that current society, in the form of a representative government, a Republican, small r Republican form of government, a constitution, banking, finances, corporations, free market system of enterprise, and of course, the organized church are all forms of social fascism, which must be broken and destroyed in order for, as they put it, the workers' revolution, the proletarian revolution, the progress into the eventual form of stateless communism, right? And so what they're doing is they're tapping into all of these things. You see this going on again today. It's the exact same forces here in the United States. The only slight difference is that in the United States, because we have such a large middle class, because the middle class is so prevalent, it's hard to get those class distinctions, or it's hard for the Bolsheviks to get those class distinctions going in terms of friction in the United States. So what they've done is they've put a twist on Marxist-Leninism. So now it's neo-Marxism, where they go after racial differences, or they go after social justice issues. They target police, they target the church, they target the clergy, whatever they can do to divide people up into groups, to pit one against the other. That's what they're doing in terms of this. And it is neo-Marxism because it's Marxism with an American twist. And they're preying on that internalized nothingness that you could say late-stage capitalism or postmodernist society has really instilled, because there's no one. And as you just point out, there are very few forces in society today that are standing up and saying, come to us with open arms. We will show you the way. This has traditionally been the role of the church. But you see now, even in the United States, and since I'm talking to Michael Voris, I might as well mention this, that, even the bishops and the clergy are divided on whether or not the question of Joe Biden, the president of the United States, one of the most recognizable public figures, not just in the U.S., but throughout the world, in terms of someone who claims to be a practicing devout Catholic, over whether or not his support for the practice of a mortal sin, the practice of abortion, right? He is an abortionist. He is an avowed abortionist in terms of his support for this, and whether or not he should be publicly denied communion. This is a farce. Right. This is a joke, right? This is thumbing the nose in the face of Catholic doctrine. This is the catechism. It has not changed. And for him to do that, it should be a resounding no. There shouldn't even need to be a vote. And if there is a vote, it should be unanimous on this question. But because organizations like this falter in their public approach, it creates doubt. It sows seeds of tension within the faith, within the flock, within the community. And it says to people that, we aren't going to stand on our principles. We're not going to stand on our doctrine. We're not going to stand on our teachings. We're going to equivocate and play politics, play with the current events, the events of the time, in order to kind of fit with the times, meet the world as it is. And that's the exact opposite of what we are taught. Be in the world, but be not of the world.
Yeah, when you look at this whole situation we have in front of us here, it's really caused by the vacuum created by the church stepping out of it. I mean, as the old saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. If the good and the right steps back
Absolutely
or
right.
looks, just doesn't do its job, there are these other sort forces just sitting, stage left, deliberately chosen stage left, ready to rush in, fill that void and take over. And then you get into this defensive battle within the church, as you mentioned, appropriately. I mean, Church Militant broke the news a few days ago that an internal memo from the U.S. bishops has said the final document, whatever it is, will not say anything about pro-abortion politicians, Catholic politicians, not being denied Holy Communion. That's never been the point of the document. It's just a big smokescreen. And people smell their way through that. They get it. They understand, this is just more, political BS by the bishops. It doesn't really mean anything. Thus, creating even a wider gap for exactly what you're talking about.
I mean, it's one thing, right? And you see this when you go to, and that's why we kind of do, and I talked about, my kids, and one thing that we're looking for in our area, and we're in the DC area right now, and we, don't plan to be here forever. I do not want to raise my kids in the Beltway. But one thing that we do look for is a traditional parish. And what we don't like, we actually moved church recently because, we were looking for a priest who would get up there and in the homily, look, he wasn't going to be telling stories about, I was in the shopping, market, I was in the supermarket, and I was in the line, and the person turned around to me and they said this and something. No, come on. We live in a world today. We live in a society that is drenched in sin. Sin is everywhere. There are so many things that you could be calling out, from the corruption of Washington, D.C., to the corruption of Hollywood, to the corrupt practices of Wall Street and everything else, the way you could just take a look at what, BlackRock is doing, trying to turn millennials and Gen Z into a renter class in the terms of buying up the stock market, or buying up all the real estate market, I should say. Right? These are moral questions. These are vast moral questions that affect all of us on a regular basis. And if you have a priest that's not up there drawing attention to any of this that's going on, I question whether or not that priest is really clued into what's going on. And beside the fact, and I don't mean to call out any specific priest on this, but this is kind of the point. You are not going to tap into any of those tensions that are very real and are very much going on in society. But if you avoid them, if you don't talk about them, what are you doing? You're creating this vacuum. That is why people do not feel engaged when they go to church. That is specifically why people turn away. You see a lot of adolescents as they move into their teens and 20s, moving away from the church, moving into these other organizations. And how many times have you heard this where you hear somebody use as some kind of argument, well, I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I ought to be an expert on this. Well, are you practicing? Are you following doctrine? Because, maybe not. When was your last plenary indulgence? And so that is what Antifa is doing. And so we've set up the website at antifabook.com, and it's so important for people to realize that these types of groups, and they're doing this right now as we speak in South America, Latin America, they are targeting churches, they are targeting priests, they are setting them on fire, they are tearing down statues of the Virgin Mary, the Blessed Virgin, and destroying them right in the streets, and they're being cheered for this. The governments in many of these cases have become paralyzed to be able to do anything about it. Here in the United States, look at the city of Portland. They are using Portland as a model for what Antifa can do and accomplish in terms of their street agitation as sort of the shock troops of this new Marxism, and the DAs and the elected officials, the politicians who drop charges on the rioters and then will turn around and put charges on the police officers that are trying to clean up the riots. That's why you just saw this special unit in the Portland Police Department. This is talk about, current events. The massive 50-person unit, the rapid response team that deals with these civil unrest incidents of Portland, has resigned their posts because of this politicized DA who is going after the people who are trying to prevent the riots and clean up the riots. So they're taking that Portland model, and you can look at the crime numbers skyrocketing, absolutely skyrocketing in Portland, the homicides, the shootings, the rest of it. That is the model that they want to use to spread across the United States. And so, to go back to your earlier point, if you are the church and if you are living in this time, you're in a target-rich environment if you're looking for things you could be talking about in your homily. So when I get in there and I hear somebody talking about his supermarket shopping cart or whatever it is, I'm just wondering where the lack of engagement is.
Yeah. What do you do, just as a last question here, because we've said, as you know, Church Militant said for a very long time, the church cannot proceed with its mission of talking about salvation and all these things on the natural plane in the various areas you're talking about without this being exposed, without this complete corruption, this desire to not preach the truth, in some cases, and a desire and activity to subvert the church. We see that constantly in the U.S. hierarchy these days. What do you think is responsible for that? That has to be exposed and swept out. What do you think has caused that problem?
Well, I do subscribe to the theory that many of these forces that are against the church have been attempting to infiltrate the church through its own ranks, and I think that you do find this time and time again when people, and in the political world, I'll have people come to me and say, Jack, the church says they want to deny Biden communion, but what about all these priests who are sinners? What about all these bishops who are covering up sin and everything else that's going on? And I turn around and I say, look, we have a problem in the church. We have sin in the church. And of course, all people are sinners. Absolutely, I got that. But the problem is this keeps happening, and this is a problem that is internal and is endemic. Right? We have the pandemic publicly, but we have an endemic problem within the church when it comes to sin in the clergy and sin in the hierarchy. This is something that needs to be cleaned up. We definitely need that return to tradition when it comes to the church, and then it can retake its role as the moral authority within American and Western civic life. That is supposed to be the role of the church, going all the way back to John the Baptist. John the Baptist was not beheaded because he was out there baptizing people in the River Jordan. No, he was beheaded because of what he said about King Herod and about his licentiousness and his fornication. That is why John the Baptist was beheaded. And he didn't do that out of anger or out of revenge. He did that out of love of the truth. And that is what the church needs to get back to. That's what society needs to get back to. That's why there needs to be truth tellers like the people that are listening to this podcast, but the people who are reading this at antifabook.com, going out there, admitting when there are problems with society. That's the first step, right? That's what they always say. The first step is admitting there's a problem, and then you can start dealing with it. So be a force multiplier. Get this book, go through, explain the corruption, understand the corruption that's public and both private, the internal corruption of souls that's going on, and you can be that force multiplier in your family, in your community, in your school, so that people actually understand what's going on, and not with not with just a bunch of random quotes or something. No, this is actual factual information. Everything in the book is footnoted. There's an extensive bibliography. My publisher actually got to me at one point. He said, Jack, the appendix and the bibliography are so big in this, it's almost as much as the book itself. And I said, well, look, that's how many sources I have. What can I say?
It's well researched. Jack, listen, thanks very much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Again, recommend everybody who is within earshot of this to, again, go to the website, antifabook.com. Get the book, read it. Look, until good people stand up and fight and start trying, to turn all of this around, this is just going to get worse. None of this stuff ever remains static, as we know. It goes one way or the other. Jack, thanks very much for being with us. Really appreciate it. God bless.
Amen. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Michael. Thank you. God bless.